My name is Arthur Pendleton. For 47 years, I was a husband to the most remarkable woman I've ever known, Eleanor. We built a life not of grand achievements or material wealth, but of small, sacred rituals. The way she'd hum while tending her rose bushes, the shared silence of reading in the same room, the specific weight of her hand in mine as we walked along the riverbank in our quiet corner of Salem, Oregon. We had a small house with a sprawling garden, a home filled more with light and love than with furniture. Our daughter, Clara, grew up there, her childhood a tapestry of scraped knees, dandelion crowns, and the scent of Eleanor's baking. Then, last spring, the light began to dim. A diagnosis, swift and merciless, stole Eleanor from me. Pancreatic cancer. It was a cruel thief, taking her piece by piece over 6 agonizing months. I became her hands, her memory, her anchor in a storm of pain and confusion. In the final weeks, when words had failed her, we communicated through touch, a language we had perfected over nearly half a century. When she finally slipped away, she did so in our bed, the morning sun casting long shadows across the quilt she had made. The silence she left behind was not peaceful, it was a roaring, hollow void. I was 70 years old, a widower in a house that was no longer a home, but a museum of a life that was over. Friends from our little church brought casseroles wrapped in foil, their condolences soft and fleeting. They meant well, but grief is a lonely country. Clara would call, her voice strained with a daughter's obligatory concern, filtered through the static of her own busy life in Portland. Her husband, Marcus, a man who measured the world in quarterly reports and stock prices, remained a polite but distant presence. It was Clara who suggested I move. "Dad, you can't rattle around in that big house alone," she'd said. "The grandkids miss you. We have a finished daylight basement. It would be good for you to be around family." The word family was a life raft, and I clung to it. The thought of my grandchildren, 10-year-old Lily and 7-year-old Noah, was a flicker of warmth in the encroaching cold. I sold the house that held every memory I cherished, a process that felt like peeling off my own skin. I packed away Eleanor's things with a reverence that bordered on painful, keeping only her worn copy of Leaves of Grass and a small, smooth stone she'd picked up on our honeymoon. I said goodbye to our garden, to the rose bush she'd called Mrs. Lincoln, and drove north to Portland, towards a new life I hoped would be a gentle epilogue. I did not expect it to be a battle for my own soul. The house in Cedar Ridge, a pristine suburb on the outskirts of Portland, was an architectural statement. All clean lines, gray tones, and glass, it felt less like a home and more like a corporate headquarters. Marcus greeted me on the porch with a firm, brief handshake, his eyes already flicking back to the phone in his other hand. Clara gave me a hug that felt rushed, her body tense. "Kids, say hi to Grandpa," she called into the cavernous entryway. Lily and Noah emerged, offered shy, practiced hugs, and then were immediately drawn back to the magnetic blue glow of their tablets. The air in the house was cool and sterile, smelling faintly of lemon cleaner and something I couldn't place, the scent of emotional distance. Marcus led me downstairs to the basement. "We think you'll be very comfortable here," he said, his tone that of a realtor closing a deal. The daylight basement was, in reality, a large room with high, narrow windows near the ceiling that let in only slivers of gray sky. The floor was polished concrete, softened by a single, thin area rug. A sleek, minimalist futon was pushed against one wall, across from a small, humming mini-fridge and a microwave. There was no sink, no counter, just a sterile bathroom off to the side. Before I could step into the bathroom, Marcus held up a hand and produced a small, silver key. "Just for the downstairs bath," he said with a tight smile. Clara and I are big believers in structure. Organized boundaries create a harmonious home. The phrase hung in the air, cold and artificial. Organized boundaries. I had never needed a key to a bathroom in my own home before. But I was tired from the drive, from the grief, from the monumental effort of dismantling my entire life. I didn't want my first act in their home to be an argument. I simply nodded and took the key, its cold metal a strange and unwelcome weight in my palm. The next morning, my back aching from the unforgiving futon, I made my way upstairs, drawn by the rich aroma of coffee. The kitchen was a gleaming expanse of stainless steel and white quartz. Clara stood at the island, meticulously slicing an avocado, while Marcus sat at the table, his laptop open. The scene was like a photograph from a lifestyle magazine, perfect and still. "Good morning," I said, my voice feeling too loud in the quiet. Clara offered a small, distracted smile. Marcus grunted in acknowledgement without looking up. I moved toward the pantry, my body on autopilot, seeking a mug for the coffee I could smell brewing. "Looking for something, Arthur?" Marcus's voice was deceptively casual, but it stopped me in my tracks. I gestured vaguely. "Just a mug for some coffee." He finally lifted his gaze from the screen, his expression unreadable. "Right. We just prefer if you ask first. We're trying to teach the kids about respecting shared resources. It's about structure. We can't have everyone just helping themselves to things whenever they feel like it." Everyone. The word landed like a stone in my gut. I wasn't a father, a grandfather. I was everyone. I looked at Clara, hoping for a lifeline, a gentle correction, anything. She didn't look up from her avocado. She just kept slicing, the knife making soft, rhythmic thuds on the cutting board. Then she spoke, her voice as flat and cool as the quartz countertop. "He's right, Dad." She paused, and the next words came out so quietly I almost thought I'd imagined them. "You're not a guest here. You're a burden." The word echoed in the pristine kitchen. Burden. It wasn't spoken with malice, but with a kind of weary, factual resignation that was somehow worse. It was a label she had already accepted, a box she had put me in. My chest tightened, and the rich smell of coffee suddenly turned sour in my throat. I couldn't find my voice. I just nodded, turned around, and walked back down the cold concrete stairs to my designated space. The word followed me, bouncing off the bare walls, settling into the thin mattress of the futon. Burden, burden, burden. From that day forward, I tried to make myself smaller, quieter, less of a presence. I became a ghost in their house. I stayed in the basement, reading the books I'd brought, watching old movies on my laptop. I bought my own groceries, cereal, instant soup, bread, and kept them in my mini fridge, eating my meals alone. They never invited me to join them for dinner. Occasionally, Clara would text me from upstairs, "Can you pick up Lily from ballet?" Or "The laundry in the dryer needs folding." I always said yes, eager for any small task that might chip away at the label she had given me. But my efforts only seemed to invite more correction. Marcus critiqued the way I folded his dress shirts. "The collar needs to be flat, Arthur, or it ruins the line." One evening, as they were entertaining friends on the deck above my room, Clara sent a text, "Could you keep the walking noises down? We can hear you." I had only walked to the bathroom. I was wearing socks. The invisible walls grew higher, thicker. I was living in their house, but I was not living with them. I was an employee they didn't have to pay, a piece of furniture they occasionally had to dust off. The hurt settled deep in my bones, a dull, constant ache that was different from the sharp pain of grieving Eleanor. This was a slow, quiet erasure of self. The final fracture came in late August. They announced they were going to the Oregon coast for a long weekend. A family trip to Cannon Beach. "That sounds wonderful," I said, a desperate hope fluttering in my chest. I loved that beach. I could pay my own way, of course. Get my own room. Clara exchanged a look with Marcus. It was he who answered, his voice smooth and final. "I think this is a time for us to focus on the nuclear family, Arthur. A little bonding time." The phrase was a sterile, clinical dismissal. I was not part of the nucleus. I was a stray electron, floating in a cold, outer orbit. I swallowed my pride. "Of course. I understand. Well, I can look after the house and water the plants while you're gone." Marcus gave a thin smile. You'll be here anyway. The Saturday of their departure was a flurry of activity. Suitcases and coolers were loaded into their gleaming SUV. The kids, excited about the beach, barely registered my wave goodbye. Just before they pulled out of the driveway, Marcus came back inside. He walked down to the basement, where my car key hung on a hook by the door. He took it. Just a precaution, he said, avoiding my eyes. Don't want you getting turned around in an unfamiliar city. The condescension was breathtaking. I had been driving for more than 50 years. Marcus, what if I need to go to the store? For food. He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture devoid of any warmth. Don't worry, we stocked your fridge for you. He lied. After the sound of their SUV faded down the street, I opened my mini fridge. Inside sat a half-empty jar of mustard and a single bottle of sparkling water. That was it. I went upstairs, my heart hammering against my ribs. I tried the pantry door. It was locked. A small, shiny padlock gleamed on the latch. My breath caught in my throat. In a last, desperate act, I lifted the lid of the kitchen trash can. On top of the garbage sat a full loaf of artisan bread and an almost untouched rotisserie chicken from the gourmet market. They hadn't eaten it. They had thrown it away, deliberately, so I couldn't have it. It was a message, delivered with chilling clarity. You are not worth feeding. You are not trusted. You are a prisoner. I sat down at their silent, immaculate kitchen table. The numbness that had been my constant companion for months began to recede, replaced by something I hadn't felt in a very long time, a clean, cold, diamond-hard anger. It wasn't a hot, messy rage. It was a profound, clarifying fury. My daughter, my Clara, who I had taught to ride a bike, whose tears I had dried after her first heartbreak, had stood by and allowed this. She had watched her husband lock up food from her own father. I didn't deliberate. I didn't agonize. The path forward was suddenly, luminously clear. I walked into Marcus's home office, a room he was excessively proud of. He'd often boasted to neighbors about his home security vault. He was careless, arrogant. I'd seen him punch in the code once while I was sorting their mail. I walked to the wall behind a framed print of a generic cityscape, slid it aside, and entered the numbers on the keypad, 0814, the date of their wedding. The heavy door clicked open. Inside were neat stacks of documents, 2 expensive watches in their cases, and a handgun in a locked box. There was also a thick envelope of cash, labeled emergency fund. I opened it. It was full of $100 bills. I took 5 of them. $500. It felt less like theft and more like severance pay. I left the watches, the gun, everything else untouched. On his pristine desk, I took a piece of his heavy, monogrammed stationery and wrote a short, simple note. You locked the food. You took my key. I am not your prisoner. I am not your child. And I am not your burden. I am your father. It seems you have forgotten what that means. I left the note in the center of his desk, called a taxi, and walked out the front door without looking back. As the cab pulled away from the curb, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in over a year. It was the exhilarating, terrifying feeling of freedom. The hotel was a modest extended stay near the airport, the kind of place that smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and stale coffee. To me, it felt like a palace. I could breathe. I ordered a pizza and a beer, the first hot meal I hadn't prepared myself in months, and ate it while watching an old black and white movie on the small television. I slept that night on a lumpy mattress, and it was the most restorative sleep I'd had since Eleanor died. The next morning, I opened my laptop and felt a surge of gratitude for my late wife's wisdom. A few months before she passed, during a quiet afternoon when the morphine had granted her a moment of clarity, she had taken my hand. Arthur, she'd said, her voice a frail whisper, I don't trust him. Marcus. He sees people as assets or liabilities. Promise me you'll protect yourself. She'd made me promise to take the entirety of her life insurance policy, $250,000, and put it in a separate account under my name alone. For your garden, she'd smiled faintly. A place to grow things, just for you. I had listened. That money was my escape hatch. I called a financial advisor that morning and then a realtor. I wasn't looking for another sterile box in a soulless suburb. I wanted a neighborhood with character, with life. I found a small, single-story cottage for sale in the St. John's neighborhood of North Portland, a place of cobbled-together gardens, friendly corner pubs, and the distant, mournful sound of ship horns from the Willamette River. It was small, a little worn around the edges, but it had a covered front porch and a patch of earth in the back that was begging for a garden. I made an offer that day. While the sale was in process, I stayed at the hotel, venturing out to explore my new city on my own terms. I discovered a small, family-run bookstore, a park overlooking the river, and a community center that needed volunteers. It was there, while shelving donated books, that I met Sarah. She was a young woman with tired, intelligent eyes and a resilience that seemed woven into her very being. She was there with her 2 sons, Leo, who was about 9, and Sam, maybe 6. They were quiet, watchful boys who clung close to their mother. Over a few conversations, I learned her story. She was a nurse, trying to get back on her feet after leaving an abusive husband, living in a cramped, subsidized apartment and working double shifts to make ends meet. She spoke of her situation not with self-pity, but with a fierce, quiet determination that reminded me so much of Eleanor. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed with frantic messages from Clara and Marcus, who had returned from their trip to find me gone. Marcus's texts were full of blustering rage. "You stole from me. You have no idea the trouble you're in. Call me immediately or I'm filing a police report." I replied with a single sentence. "Go ahead. And be sure to tell them why you padlocked the pantry." The line went silent. I blocked both their numbers. The silence that followed was a bomb. My only regret was the grandchildren. The thought of Lily and Noah was a persistent, tender ache in my heart, a loss I knew I would have to learn to carry. 3 weeks later, I closed on the cottage. The day I got the keys, I walked through the empty rooms, the scent of old wood and dust filling my lungs. This was mine. No locks on the doors, no one monitoring my footsteps. I could make coffee at 3 a.m. if I wanted to. I could leave my shoes by the door. That evening, I sat on my porch swing with a cup of tea and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. It was a peace so profound it felt holy. A few days after I moved in, I saw Sarah and her boys at the local grocery store. She looked exhausted, juggling a basket of essentials and trying to soothe a fretful Sam. On an impulse born of Eleanor's wisdom, "Build a garden, just for you," I approached her. I told her about my new cottage and about my old life and about the gaping silence in my days. I didn't have a duplex to offer, but I did have an idea. I invited her and the boys over for a simple dinner of spaghetti and meatballs. The boys, shy at first, slowly warmed up in the small, cozy house. Leo discovered my collection of National Geographic magazines, and Sam was fascinated by a wooden bird I'd carved years ago. Watching them, a piece of my heart that had been frozen for months began to thaw. After dinner, as Sarah was getting ready to leave, I made my offer. "I know this is forward," I began, my voice unsteady, "but I have a spare room. And a big yard. I'm just an old man with too much quiet. If you and the boys ever needed a safe place to land for a while, a port in the storm, the room is yours. No rent. Just fill the house with a little life again." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, the first I had ever seen her shed. They weren't tears of sadness, but of overwhelming relief. "People aren't this kind," she whispered. "My wife was," I said. "I'm just trying to live up to her example." A week later, they moved in. They arrived with 2 duffel bags and a cardboard box of their most precious belongings. That first night, the sound of the boys' laughter as I read them a chapter from The Hobbit was the sweetest music I had ever heard. I wasn't just a burden anymore. I was Grandpa Arthur. I was building a new garden, not of roses, but of people. Life settled into a gentle, healing rhythm. Sarah found a better nursing position at a nearby clinic. The boys blossomed, their quiet watchfulness replaced by the boisterous energy of happy children. We planted a vegetable garden in the backyard, tomatoes, zucchini, and a row of sunflowers that grew taller than me. But the past has a long shadow. One afternoon, I was weeding the front flower bed when I saw a familiar gray SUV drive slowly down my street. It paused for a moment in front of my house before speeding away. Clara. My heart clenched. It wasn't a visit, it was surveillance. 2 days later, a plain white envelope appeared in my mailbox. No stamp, no return address. Inside was a photograph, clearly taken with a telephoto lens, of me and the boys on the front porch, laughing as we built a birdhouse. Scrawled across the bottom in thick, black marker were 3 words, replacing US with trash. The cruelty of it stole my breath. This wasn't about concern. It was about possession. I was their property, and I had escaped. That night, I couldn't sleep. The next morning, I woke to find the tires on my old Subaru slashed, the rubber gaping open in 4 ragged wounds. My neighbor, a kind retiree named George, said he'd seen a man in a hoodie near my car late last night. He had a funny walk, George said. A bit of a limp. Marcus had undergone knee surgery the previous year. He still had a slight limp when he was tired or stressed. The anger returned, but this time it was colder, sharper. This was no longer just about me. They were threatening my new family, this fragile piece we had built. I was done being the quiet, grieving old man. I went to see a lawyer, not the placid estate planner I'd used before, but a sharp, tenacious woman recommended by a friend from the VFW. I told her everything. I showed her the photo, told her about the tires, played her the saved voicemail from Marcus. They tried to break you, she said, her eyes narrowed. Now let's make sure they can never touch you, or your assets again. We began to build a fortress, not of brick and mortar, but of legal documents. We redrafted my will, placing all my assets into an ironclad trust. We changed my power of attorney and healthcare proxy, naming Sarah as the primary. My lawyer even suggested I install security cameras, creating a digital record of any further harassment. Just as the paperwork was being finalized, Marcus appeared at my front door. He didn't knock. He just stood on the porch, arms crossed, a smug look on his face as I was watering a pot of geraniums. Arthur, he began, as if we were old friends. We need to talk. I know you've been busy with lawyers. I get it, you're angry. But we're family. This is ridiculous. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Do you really think Eleanor would want you to leave everything to some grifter and her bastard kids? The vulgarity of the word, the sheer venom behind it, struck me silent. I just stared at him, the watering can still in my hand. He smirked, mistaking my silence for weakness. I came to give you a heads up. Clara and I are contesting the will. We're going to file for conservatorship. You're clearly not in your right mind. You have a history of depression since Eleanor passed. It'll be an easy case to make. We're going to protect Mom's legacy from this. He waved a dismissive hand towards my cozy, lived-in cottage. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I looked him dead in the eye. You need to leave my property. Now. He laughed, a short, ugly sound. But he turned and walked away. I watched him go, his slight limp more pronounced than ever. I stepped back inside, my hands shaking not with fear, but with a cold, resolute fury. I locked the door and immediately called my lawyer. The war wasn't over. It had just begun. Clara filed the petition for conservatorship a week later. The legal documents were a work of fiction, painting me as a senile, grief-stricken old man being manipulated by a predatory younger woman. They used lines from my most vulnerable emails, sent in the depths of my sorrow, as proof of my mental instability. The court scheduled a hearing and appointed an investigator to evaluate my competence. They were trying to strip me of my home, my autonomy, and my dignity, all under the guise of caring for me. But they underestimated me. And they had no idea what my lawyer and I had been quietly doing. We had hired a private investigator, an expensive but thorough man who uncovered something that shifted the entire landscape of our battle. Marcus, in his arrogance, had used my social security number, gleaned from old financial documents I'd had at their house, to open a high-limit credit card in my name. He had maxed it out, nearly $15,000 on lavish dinners, designer clothes, and a business trip to Las Vegas. It was identity theft. It was fraud. It was a felony. The day before our court hearing, my lawyer submitted the evidence to the judge, along with a police report for the fraud and a request for a restraining order against Marcus, backed by the security camera footage of him lurking near my property the night my tires were slashed. The change was instantaneous. The next morning, Clara's lawyer called to withdraw the conservatorship petition, citing new information. They were terrified of the criminal charges, of the public exposure. But I wasn't done. The pain they had inflicted, the fear they had instilled in Sarah and her boys, demanded more than just a retreat. I filed a civil suit against Marcus for the fraud and emotional distress. His house of cards, built on lies and intimidation, began to crumble. His consulting business, already teetering, collapsed when news of the lawsuit got out. Clara called me, sobbing. "Dad, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know about the credit card. I was just so scared. I saw you giving everything away to strangers and I panicked." Her words were hollow. They rang with the same emptiness as her voice in the kitchen that morning. "Did you know he locked the pantry, Clara?" I asked quietly. A choked silence on the other end of the line. "You stood there and sliced an avocado while your husband told me I was a burden," I said, not with anger, but with a deep, bottomless sorrow. "You let that happen. That's all I need to know." I gently hung up the phone. 6 months later, Marcus was convicted of felony fraud. Clara filed for divorce. She sent me a long, pleading letter which I read and then placed in a box with the other relics of a life that was no more. The lawsuit settled in my favor, but the victory felt ashes in my mouth. Portland, for all its beauty, was now tainted with the ghosts of this battle. I had won, but I wanted peace more than I wanted victory. I deeded the cottage to Sarah, signing it over to her free and clear. The look on her face, the sheer, staggering disbelief that such goodness could exist for her, was the only reward I needed. I hugged Leo and Sam goodbye, promising to write, telling them to grow up to be good men who tended their own gardens. I packed my few belongings into my old Subaru, its tires new and strong, and I drove east, away from the coast, away from the city of my pain and my rebirth. I found my way to a small town nestled in the rolling hills of Missouri, a place called Havenwood. I bought a little house with a porch swing and a garden out back, just big enough for one. I spend my mornings with a cup of coffee, listening to the cardinals sing. I've joined the local historical society. I'm teaching a woodworking class to teenagers at the community center. I have friends. I have purpose. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, I think of Clara. I remember the little girl with firefly jars and grass-stained knees, and a wave of profound sadness washes over me. I miss my grandchildren. That is a wound that may never fully heal. But I have learned the hardest lesson of my life. Blood does not make a family. Love, respect, and kindness do. They tried to make me believe I was a burden, a thing to be managed and contained. But a person is not a burden. A person is a story. And I, Arthur Pendleton, am finally writing my own ending.